I'm Sarah Matthews, 34, a struggling single mother who's spent years being reminded that I'm the family disappointment. 3 months ago, as my father lay dying in his hospital bed, he looked me straight in the eye and said the words that would haunt me. You don't deserve a single penny of what I've built. You've been nothing but a burden. Those words shattered what little hope I had left for reconciliation. I walked out of that hospital room believing I'd lost not just my father, but any chance of financial security for my daughter and me. The golden children, my siblings who'd always been his pride and joy, would inherit everything, just as he'd always promised them. But yesterday, his lawyer called with news that changed everything. Apparently, my father had been keeping the biggest secret of all, one that would expose the truth about our family and reveal just how wrong we'd all been about each other. If you've ever felt like the forgotten child in your family, stay with Emmy. This story is about to get much more complicated than any of us ever imagined. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was rushing to get Emma ready for school. I almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, and I'd been avoiding calls from creditors for weeks. But something made me swipe to accept. Double quotes, Ms. Matthews. This is Robert Harrison from Harrison and Associates. I was your father's attorney. I need to schedule a meeting with you regarding his estate. I nearly dropped the phone. I'm sorry, but I think there's been a mistake. My father made it very clear that I wouldn't be inheriting anything. You should probably call my brother Michael or my sister Jennifer. There was a pause on the other end. No mistake, Miss Matthews. According to your father's will, you are the primary beneficiary. Could you come in today? My legs felt weak. I sank into the kitchen chair, watching Emma pour too much cereal into her bowl. Primary beneficiary? That's impossible. He told me I didn't deserve anything. I understand this may come as a shock. Your father's estate is valued at approximately $2.3 million. You're inheriting roughly 80% of it. The words hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't breathe. Emma looked up at me with concern in her 8-year-old eyes. Mommy, you okay? I managed a nod, though my world was spinning. Mr. Harrison, I think you need to double-check your paperwork. My father despised me. He spent my entire childhood making that clear. Ms. Matthews, I've been practicing law for 30 years. I reviewed this will multiple times with your father. He was very specific about his wishes. Can he be here at 2 o'clock? I agreed, though I was certain there had been some terrible mix-up. After hanging up, I sat in stunned silence. Emma finished her cereal and grabbed her backpack. Is Grandpa sending us money from heaven? She asked innocently. I forced a smile. I don't know, sweetheart, maybe. The drive to the law office felt surreal. I kept expecting to wake up from this bizarre dream. Mr. Harrison's office was in one of those old downtown buildings with marble floors and mahogany everything. I felt underdressed in my Target blouse and department store slacks. Mr. Harrison was a distinguished man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He welcomed me warmly and gestured to a leather chair across from his massive desk. Ms. Matthews, I want to start by saying how sorry I am for your loss. Your father was a remarkable man. I almost laughed. Remarkable isn't the word I'd use. He studied me for a moment. I suspect there's quite a story there. But let me show you what your father left for you. He opened a file and pulled out a legal document. The letterhead read, Last Will and Testament of Robert James Matthews. My hands trembled as I took it. To my daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Matthews, I read aloud. I leave the bulk of my estate, including my home, investments, and business assets, totaling approximately $1.8 million. I looked up at Mr. Harrison in disbelief. This can't be real. It's very real. Your siblings Michael and Jennifer each receive $50,000 and a few personal items. The rest goes to you. I felt dizzy. But why? He hated me. He spent years telling me I was worthless, that I'd never amount to anything. Why would he leave me everything? Mr. Harrison leaned back in his chair. Your father came to see me 6 months ago. He was very ill, and he knew his time was limited. He told me he had made mistakes, serious mistakes, in how he treated you. He said you were the only one of his children who had never asked him for money, never taken advantage of his generosity. That's because he never offered it to me. I said bitterly, perhaps. But he also said you were the only one who had ever sacrificed for him. He mentioned something about medical bills. The memory hit me like a punch to the gut. 3 years ago, when Dad was first diagnosed with cancer, Michael and Jennifer had both refused to help with the mounting medical costs. I had emptied my savings account, every penny I'd managed to set aside for Emma's future, to help pay for his treatment. He never even thanked me. I paid for his chemotherapy. I whispered. He knew that. And he never forgot it. Tears stung my eyes. Then, why was he so cruel to me at the end? Why did he tell me I didn't deserve anything? Mr. Harrison's expression grew sad. I think your father was a proud man who didn't know how to express love. Perhaps he thought being harsh would make you stronger. Or perhaps he was protecting you from your siblings' expectations. I stared at the will, still not believing it was real. What happens now? Now we begin the probate process. I should warn you, Ms. Matthews, your siblings aren't going to be happy about this. They may try to contest the will. On what grounds? They'll probably claim your father wasn't mentally competent when he signed this, or that you somehow manipulated him. Neither claim has merit, but that won't stop them from trying. I thought about Michael and Jennifer, about their expensive cars and designer clothes, about how they'd always assumed they'd inherit everything. Let them try, I said quietly. For once in my life, I'm not going to back down. Growing up, I learned early that love in the Matthews family came with conditions I could never seem to meet. Michael was the golden boy, 3 years older than me, charming and athletic. Jennifer was the princess, 2 years younger, beautiful and popular. And then there was me, the middle child who somehow never measured up to either of them. I remember the family photo from my high school graduation. While my siblings flanked Dad with their perfect smiles, I stood slightly apart, looking genuinely happy for once. I just found out I'd earned a full scholarship to college, something that should have made any parent proud. Instead, Dad had shrugged and said, "Well, at least you won't be costing me any more money." That photo was one of the few where I looked truly joyful, where I believed for a moment that I might actually be worth something. Michael had dropped out of college after 2 years to pursue his entrepreneurial dreams, which mostly involved spending Dad's money on get-rich-quick schemes. Jennifer had majored in communication and minored in shopping, graduating with barely passing grades that Dad had somehow made disappear through generous donations to the university. But I had earned my scholarship through pure academic achievement. I'd worked 2 jobs throughout high school, maintained a 4.0 GPA, and tutored other students to make ends meet. None of that mattered to Dad. Success that came through hard work and intelligence wasn't as impressive as Michael's natural charisma or Jennifer's effortless beauty. The patterns were established early. When Michael wanted to start his first business at 22, Dad wrote him a check for $100,000 without question. When Jennifer wanted to move to California to find herself, Dad paid for her apartment and living expenses for 2 years. When I graduated summa cum laude and got accepted to graduate school, Dad told me I was on my own. "You're smart enough to figure it out," he'd said. "Besides, more education might make you think you're better than everyone else." I'd worked my way through graduate school, taking out loans and working as a teaching assistant. I'd earned my master's degree in social work, driven by a desire to help families like mine families, where children grew up believing they weren't good enough. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years helping other people work through family trauma while carrying around my own wounds like invisible scars. I'd married young, desperate to create the loving family I'd never had. When that marriage fell apart after 3 years, leaving me pregnant and alone, Dad's only comment was that I'd made my bed. Emma was born during the worst period of my life. I was broke, heartbroken, and terrified. Michael and Jennifer were both living comfortable lives funded by Dad's generosity, while I struggled to pay for diapers and formula. I'd swallowed my pride and asked Dad for help just once. He'd looked at me with those cold gray eyes and said, "I'm not running a charity for poor life choices." That was the day I stopped trying to win his approval. I threw myself into being the best mother I could be with what little I had. I took on extra clients, worked nights and weekends, and somehow managed to keep us afloat. Emma never went hungry, never lacked for love, even if we couldn't afford the brand name clothes her cousins wore. Meanwhile, Michael's business ventures continued to fail spectacularly. There was the restaurant that closed after 6 months, the tech startup that never launched, the real estate scheme that cost Dad nearly $500,000. Each failure was met with comfort and another check. He's learning, Dad would say. Success takes time. Jennifer's journey was equally expensive. There was the failed modeling career in Los Angeles, the brief stint as a yoga instructor, the art phase that resulted in a gallery showing that sold exactly 0 pieces. Dad funded each dream without question, proud of his daughter's creativity and spirit. I watched it all from the sidelines, working 60-hour weeks to provide for Emma while my siblings lived off Dad's endless generosity. The worst part wasn't the money, it was the casual way Dad would brag about them to others while acting like I didn't exist. Michael's developing a new app, he'd tell his golf buddies. Jennifer's having a show at a gallery in Beverly Hills. If anyone asked about me, he'd change the subject or mention that I was doing social work or something. The patterns continued, right up until Dad's illness. When he was first diagnosed with cancer, I was the first one to call, the first one to offer help. Michael was too busy with work to visit regularly. Jennifer was too emotional to handle seeing him sick. But I was there for every appointment, every treatment, every sleepless night when the pain was too much, when the bills started mounting and insurance wouldn't cover everything. I made a decision that would haunt me for months. I emptied my savings, account $23,000 that I'd been carefully accumulating for Emma's future, and used it to pay for Dad's chemotherapy. I didn't tell him where the money came from. I just quietly handled it, the way I'd handled everything else in my life. Michael and Jennifer, when asked to contribute, both had excuses. Michael was having cash flow issues with his latest venture. Jennifer was between jobs and couldn't spare anything. They promised to pay me back eventually, but we all knew that would never happen. Dad never thanked me for the money. He never acknowledged the sacrifice I'd made. In his mind, I was just doing what any daughter should do. But when Michael brought him a $50 flower arrangement or Jennifer sent a care package, those gestures were treated like precious gifts. Looking back now, I realized I was caught in a cycle that had been established in childhood. I kept trying to earn love through sacrifice and service, while my siblings earned it simply by existing. Dad's harsh treatment of me had become so normalized that I'd accepted it as deserved. The night before he died, when he looked at me with such contempt and told me I didn't deserve his inheritance, I felt that familiar stab of pain. But this time, something was different. Instead of trying to argue or prove my worth, I simply nodded and walked away. I was done begging for crumbs of affection from a man who seemed incapable of getting them now. Sitting in Mr. Harrison's office, with that will in my hands, I realized that perhaps Dad had seen more than I'd given him credit for. Perhaps he'd understood exactly who had been there for him when it mattered most. The question was, what would my siblings do when they found out their assumptions about the inheritance were completely wrong? I knew I had to tell Michael and Jennifer about the will, but I wasn't prepared for the explosion that followed. I decided to call them separately, thinking it might be easier to handle their reactions one at a time. I was wrong, Michael answered. On the first ring, his voice carrying that familiar tone of barely concealed impatience he used when talking to me. Sarah, I'm in a meeting. What do you want? I need to talk to you about Dad's will. What about it? Look, I know you're probably disappointed, but Dad was pretty clear about his intentions. Jennifer and I will make sure you're not left completely out in the cold. The condescension in his voice made my jaw clench. Actually, Michael, I'm the primary beneficiary. I inherit 80% of the estate. The silence stretched so long I thought. The call had dropped. Then came the explosion. What the hell are you talking about? That's impossible. You're lying. I'm not lying. I just came from the lawyer's office. Dad left me almost everything. No way. No fucking way. Dad wouldn't do that. You must have manipulated him, somehow got to him when he was sick and confused. I didn't manipulate anyone. Bullshit. His voice was so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. You were always sneaking around, playing the victim. You probably convinced him we didn't care about him. Michael, calm down. I'm as shocked as you are. You're going to contest this, right? Obviously, there's been some mistake. Dad's lawyer screwed up, or maybe you influenced him somehow. This will never hold up in court. I felt something shift. Inside me, a strength I hadn't felt in years. I'm not contesting anything. This is what Dad wanted. Like, hell it is. I'm calling my lawyer right now. This is fraud, Sarah. You'll be lucky if you don't end up in prison. He hung up before I could respond. My hands were shaking as I dialed Jennifer's number. Jennifer's reaction was different but equally explosive. Where Michael had been angry, she was calculating. That's interesting, she said after I explained the situation. Dad never mentioned changing his will to me. When did this happen? About 6 months ago, according to Mr. Harrison. 6 months ago. I could hear the wheels turning in her head. That was right after Dad's cancer came back. He was on a lot of pain medication then, wasn't he? Jennifer, he was completely lucid when he made these decisions. Was he? Because from what I remember, he was pretty confused toward the end. Remember when he called me by Mom's name? And that time, he couldn't remember what year it was. That was one incident, and he was having a bad day. Sarah, honey, I'm not trying to hurt you, but this doesn't make sense. Dad was very clear about his intentions. He wanted Michael and me to carry on his legacy. You've never shown any interest in the family business or maintaining his properties. What family business? Michael's failed ventures? Jennifer's voice turned cold. That's unfair. Michael has been working hard to build something meaningful, and I've been helping Dad with his investments and social connections. What have you contributed? The question hit me like a slap. I paid for his medical treatment when you and Michael refused to help. You paid for one treatment, Sarah. We've been supporting Dad financially for years. Michael borrowed money for his businesses. Yes, but that was an investment in the family's future. I've been managing Dad's social calendar, making sure he stayed connected to his friends and business associates. I almost laughed at the absurdity. You mean you've been spending his money on parties and networking events? I've been taking care of him. And now you're claiming he secretly changed his will to leave everything to you? The daughter who barely visited, who brought her problems to his doorstep, who always made everything about her own drama. That's not fair, isn't it? Sarah, I love you, but you have to admit this looks suspicious. You were desperate for money, struggling to raise Emma alone, and suddenly Dad's will changes dramatically in your favor? After 34 years of you being the difficult child? I was never difficult. I was ignored. You were challenging. You always questioned everything. Always made Dad feel like he wasn't good enough. Do you remember when you refused to come to family dinners because you said they were toxic? Do you remember when you told Dad his parenting had damaged you? I did remember. I'd been in therapy, learning to set boundaries, and I tried to have an honest conversation with Dad about our relationship. It had gone badly. I was trying to heal our relationship. You were trying to blame him for your problems. And now, conveniently, he's left you everything. I'm sorry, Sarah, but this doesn't pass the smell test. Jennifer, I didn't know about this will until yesterday. I'm as shocked as you are. Are you? Because you've been hovering around Dad's sickbed for months. You had plenty of opportunity to influence him. I was taking care of him because you and Michael wouldn't. We had our own ways of showing love. We didn't need to make a big show of playing martyr. The conversation ended with Jennifer promising to look into this legally. An hour later, both of them showed up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door to find them standing there like a unified front, Michael in his expensive suit, Jennifer in her designer clothes, both looking like they'd stepped out of a magazine spread about successful people. They pushed past me into my modest living room. We need to talk, Michael said without preamble. Emma was at her friend's house. Thank God. I didn't want her to witness what was about to happen. There's nothing to talk about, I said. The will is valid. The will is suspicious, Jennifer corrected. And we're going to prove it. Fine. Do what you want. Michael pulled out his phone and showed me a business card. This is my attorney. He specializes in estate law. He says wills get overturned all the time, especially when there's evidence of undue influence or mental incompetence. Dad wasn't incompetent, wasn't he? Jennifer sat down on my couch without being invited. He was taking heavy pain medication. He was isolated, mostly seeing you. He was facing his own mortality. People in that state are very vulnerable to manipulation. I never manipulated him. Didn't you? Michael started pacing. You swooped in during his illness, playing the devoted daughter. You paid for some of his medical bills, making yourself look like the hero. You probably badmouthed Jennifer and me, made it seem like we didn't care. You didn't care. You were both too busy with your own lives to help when he needed it. That's not true, Jennifer said. We were protecting ourselves emotionally. Watching someone you love die is devastating. We coped differently than you did. You coped by ignoring him. We coped by maintaining our mental health. Michael shot back. You threw yourself into his care because you needed to be needed. You made his illness about you. The accusations kept coming. I'd been manipulative, desperate, calculating. I'd taken advantage of a sick old man's vulnerability. I'd poisoned him against his other children. I'd somehow convinced him to change a will that he'd spent years planning. You know what I think? Jennifer stood up, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. I think you've been planning this for years. I think you've been playing the victim, making Dad feel guilty about how he treated you, setting up this whole scenario. That's insane. Is it? You're a social worker, Sarah. You understand. Manipulation and family dynamics. You know exactly which buttons to push to make someone feel guilty or responsible. Michael nodded, and you were desperate. Single mother, struggling financially, watching your siblings live comfortable lives. You saw an opportunity and you took it. Get out, I said quietly. We're not done. Get out of my house, now. They exchanged a look, and I saw something pass between them, a recognition that I wasn't the same pushover they'd grown up with. This isn't over, Michael said as they headed for the door. We're going to fight this will, and we're going to win. When we do, you'll be lucky to get anything. And Sarah? Jennifer paused at the door. When this is all over, don't expect to be welcome at family gatherings anymore. You've made your choice. After they left, I sat in my quiet living room and realized something important had just happened. For the first time in my life, I'd stood up to my siblings without backing down. I'd let them throw their worst accusations at me without crumbling or apologizing or trying to make peace. They could contest the will if they wanted. They could hire their expensive lawyers and make their claims about manipulation and mental incompetence. But I knew the truth now. Dad had made his choice with a clear mind and a full understanding of who his children really were. The real question was whether I was strong enough to fight for what he'd left me. 3 days after my confrontation with Michael and Jennifer, I found myself standing in Dad's house with a key I'd never expected to own. Mr. Harrison had given it to me along with a general suggestion that I should go through Dad's personal effects sooner rather than later, especially if my siblings were planning to contest the will. The house felt different now, not like the imposing fortress of my childhood, but like a museum of a life I never fully understood. I started in Dad's study, the room where he'd spent most of his time in recent years, surrounded by books, papers, and memories. His desk was massive, an antique mahogany piece that had always intimidated me as a child. I'd really been allowed. In this room growing up, it was Dad's sanctuary, off limits to children who might disturb his important work. Now, as I sat in his leather chair, I felt like an intruder uncovering secrets I wasn't meant to see. The first surprise was in the bottom drawer tucked beneath a stack of tax documents. My college transcript from 15 years ago, carefully preserved in a manila folder labeled Sarah Academic Records. I stared at it in disbelief. Why would he have kept this? He barely acknowledged my graduation, let alone my summa cum. Laud honors, but there was more. Letters of recommendation from my professors, praising my dedication and intelligence. A newspaper clipping from when I'd received an award for outstanding community service during my graduate program. A copy of my thesis on family trauma and healing with handwritten notes in the margins. Dad's handwriting my hands trembled as I read his annotations. Insightful analysis. He'd written next to a section about generational patterns of emotional neglect. She understands more than I gave her credit for, appeared next to my discussion of how parents sometimes withhold affection, believing it will make their children stronger. How long had he kept this? How long had he been reading my work, thinking about my insights into the very dynamics that had shaped our family? I found more treasures as I dug deeper. A photo from my high school graduation, not the formal family portrait, but a candid shot. Someone had taken of me laughing with friends, looking genuinely happy. On the back, in Dad's careful script, Sarah the only one who earned her way. There were birthday cards I'd sent him over the years, cards he'd never acknowledged receiving. He kept every one. There were newspaper clippings about the nonprofit where I worked, articles mentioning my contributions to local family counseling programs. In one margin, he'd written, "Proud of her dedication." The most shocking discovery was a stack of letters drafts, really written in Dad's handwriting but never sent. Letter after letter addressed to me, each one an attempt at apology that he'd apparently never been able to complete. "Dear Sarah," one began, "I know I've been too hard on you over the years. I see your strength and your kindness, and I'm ashamed of how I've treated you. You remind me so much of your mother, her compassion, her intelligence, her fierce independence. Maybe that's why I've been so tough on you. I wanted you to be strong enough to survive without depending on anyone else. But I realize now that I may have gone too far." Another draft was more direct. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. You've never asked me for anything, never taken advantage of my generosity the way your siblings have. You've built a life on your own terms, raised Emma to be a wonderful child, and maintained your integrity even when it would have been easier to compromise. I should have told you how proud I am instead of constantly criticizing." Each letter broke off midway as if he couldn't find the right words or the courage to continue. Some had been crumpled and smoothed out again, suggesting he tried multiple times to finish them. The final draft was the most heartbreaking. "Sarah, I'm dying and I need you to know that you were never the disappointment. You were the success. Story I was too proud to acknowledge. Michael and Jennifer needed my financial support to survive, but you thrived despite my neglect. That strength, that independence, it came from you, not from me. I'm sorry I couldn't say this while I was healthy enough to mean it properly. I sat there crying, surrounded by evidence that the father I thought barely tolerated me had actually been watching, learning, and in his own twisted way caring. He'd just never known how to express it. My phone buzzed. A text from Michael. "Hope you're enjoying your last days in Dad's house. Our lawyer says the will contest should be filed by next week." I looked around at the evidence of Dad's true feelings. The kept mementos, the proud annotations, the failed attempts at reconciliation. They had no idea who Dad really was or what he actually valued. They thought his love was measured in dollar signs and public praise, but the real treasures were hidden in bottom drawers and unfinished letters. I took photos of everything, transcripts, the letters, the newspaper clippings. Whatever happened in court, I now had proof that Dad's decision hadn't been made during a moment of confused illness. It had been the culmination of years of quiet observation and growing understanding. As I prepared to leave, I noticed one more thing tucked behind a framed photo on his desk. A small piece of paper folded many times. When I opened it, I found a crayon drawing I'd made in elementary school, a stick figure family with my hero daddy, written across the top in my childish handwriting. He kept it for 25 years. On the back, in his adult handwriting, was a single line. "Before I forgot how to be the hero she thought I was." I understood then that Dad's harsh treatment hadn't come from lack of love. It had come from his own fear that he wasn't worthy of the love I'd offered so freely as a child. He pushed me away because he couldn't bear the responsibility of being someone's hero. But he never stopped hoping that somehow, someday, he could earn back the uncomplicated adoration I'd once given him. The irony was devastating. I'd spent 30 years trying to prove I was worthy of his love, never realizing that he'd spent the same 30 years believing he wasn't worthy of mine. The financial records I found in Dad's filing cabinet told a story that made my stomach turn. Folder after folder of bank statements, loan documents, and canceled checks painted a picture of my siblings that was far different from the successful image they projected to the world. I'd started looking through Dad's finances to better understand the estate I'd inherited, but what I discovered was a decades-long pattern of financial dependency that would have shocked anyone who knew Michael and Jennifer socially. Michael's business ventures, which Dad had always proudly described as investments in his son's entrepreneurial spirit, were actually a series of expensive disasters. The restaurant he'd opened in 2018 had cost Dad $200,000 in startup capital, only to close 8 months later when Michael defaulted on rent. The tech startup that was supposed to revolutionize online shopping had burned through $150,000 before producing anything more than a basic website that never launched. But the real eye-opener was the real estate deal. That had gone wrong in 2020. Michael had convinced Dad to co-sign on a loan for a property development project, claiming he had inside knowledge of upcoming zoning changes that would make the land incredibly valuable. The zoning changes never materialized, the project failed, and Dad had been stuck paying off a $400,000 loan that Michael simply walked away from. Each failure was documented in meticulous detail. Dad had kept every contract, every promissory note, every explanation from Michael about why this time things would be different. The pattern was heartbreaking, a father desperately trying to believe in his son's potential, while watching hundreds of thousands of dollars disappear into one failed scheme after another. Jennifer's financial situation was equally troubling, though her dependencies were more subtle. What I'd initially assumed were gifts Dad paying for her apartment, her car, her credit card bills, were actually ongoing support for what appeared to be a serious gambling problem. The bank statements showed monthly transfers to Jennifer ranging from $3,000 to $8,000, always labeled as living expenses or emergency assistance. But when I cross-referenced the dates with her social media posts, a different pattern emerged. The largest transfers consistently followed trips to Las Vegas, Atlantic City, or local casinos. There were also payments to credit card companies on her behalf, massive amounts that suggested she'd been living far beyond her means for years. One statement showed Dad paying off $47,000 in credit card debt for Jennifer in a single month, only to have her rack up another $30,000 in charges within 6 months. I found a folder marked Jennifer Personal that contained several letters from debt collectors and a disturbing correspondence with a rehab facility specializing in gambling addiction. Dad had apparently tried to get Jennifer into treatment twice, both times paying substantial fees up front. According to the facility's records, she'd checked out against medical advice both times. The most shocking discovery was a series of emails between Dad and a private investigator from 2 years ago. Dad had apparently become suspicious about Michael's latest business claims and had hired someone to verify the details. The investigator's report was damning. Michael's partnerships with major tech companies were fictional. His claims about pending patents were false. And several of his business associates had criminal records for fraud. Another investigation into Jennifer revealed that she'd been lying about her employment status for over a year, claiming to work for a marketing firm that had actually fired her for attendance issues related to her gambling. The report also documented her debts to several illegal bookmakers' debts that Dad had quietly paid off to protect her safety net. As I read through years of financial records, a painful picture emerged. Dad hadn't been generous to Michael and Jennifer. Out of pride in their accomplishments, he'd been enabling their failures out of desperation and fear. He'd known they were lying to him, known they were using him, but he continued paying because he didn't know how to stop without losing them entirely. There were several draft letters to both of them in his files, attempting to set boundaries or demand accountability. None had ever been sent. In one particularly heartbreaking draft to Michael, Dad had written, "I'm tired of being your ATM. When will you show me the man I raised you to be? But instead of sending it, he'd written another. Check. A letter to Jennifer was even more desperate. Your mother would be heartbroken to see what you've become. Please get help before it's too late. That letter was also never sent, replaced by another payment to cover her gambling debts. The contrast with how he treated me was stark and painful. While I'd given Michael and Jennifer endless financial support despite their failures, he'd refused to help me even when I was struggling as a single mother. But now I understood why. Michael and Jennifer had needed his money to maintain their lifestyles. I built mine without his help. He'd withheld financial support from me not because he cared less, but because he trusted me more. He'd seen that I was capable of succeeding on my own, while his other children had proven they couldn't survive without his constant intervention. The final piece of the puzzle was a meeting note from Dad's consultation with Mr. Harrison 6 months before his death. In Dad's handwriting, I read, "Sarah is the only one who never asked for money. She gave it to me instead. Michael and Jennifer see me as a bank account. Sarah sees me as a father, even when I failed to be one." Below that, in different ink, probably added later, he'd written, "They'll hate her for this inheritance, but she's the only one who can handle it responsibly. She's the only one who won't waste it." I thought about Michael's expensive suits and Jennifer's designer handbags, about their confident assumptions that they'd inherit Dad's wealth. They built their entire adult lives around the expectation that Dad's money would always be there to catch them when they fell. Now I understood why Dad's final words to me had been so cruel. He'd been protecting me from their inevitable fury, making sure that when they learned about the will, they couldn't claim I manipulated him through false shows of affection. His rejection had been his final gift, plausible deniability that I'd earned his favor through emotional manipulation. As I closed the files and prepared to leave Dad's house, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Sadness for the father who'd felt trapped between love and enabling, anger at my siblings for taking advantage of his desperation, and something I'd never expected to feel, gratitude for the harsh treatment that had forced me to become strong enough to succeed on my own. Dad had given Michael and Jennifer everything they'd asked for, and it had made them weak and dependent. He'd given me nothing but criticism and impossibly high standards, and it had made me self-reliant and resilient. Now they were about to learn that their inheritance, like their entire adult lives, had been built on a foundation that was far less stable than they'd assumed. The folder labeled Medical Sarah Payment was tucked away in Dad's personal safe, and when I found it, everything about our relationship suddenly made sense. Inside were copies of medical bills from his cancer treatment 3 years ago, along with payment records that documented exactly how those bills had been settled. Remembered that time as one of the most difficult periods of my life. Dad had just been diagnosed with aggressive prostate cancer that had already metastasized. The treatment plan was extensive surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, and several experimental procedures that weren't fully covered by insurance. The bills were staggering. When the hospital's financial coordinator had explained that insurance would cover about 60% of the cost, leaving roughly $180,000 in out-of-pocket expenses, I'd watched the color drain from Dad's face. He was comfortable, certainly, but he wasn't liquid wealthy. Most of his assets were tied up in property and long-term investments that couldn't be easily accessed without significant penalties. I called Michael first, explaining the situation and asking if he could help cover some of the medical costs. His response was swift and cold. "Dad's got plenty of money. He doesn't need our help. Besides, I've got my own expenses right now with the restaurant startup." This was rich, considering Dad had just invested $200,000 in Michael's restaurant venture 2 months earlier. But Michael seemed to view Dad's money as unlimited and his own financial obligations as paramount. Jennifer's response was even more frustrating. "I can't deal with this right now, Sarah. The stress of Dad being sick is already too much for me. I can't handle the financial pressure, too. You're better at managing this kind of thing anyway." Better at managing meant I was the one willing to sacrifice while they preserved their comfortable lifestyles. Jennifer was in the middle of renovating her condo with Dad's money, of course, and couldn't be bothered to redirect those funds toward keeping him alive. So I'd made a decision that I knew would impact Emma's future, but felt necessary for Dad's survival. I've been carefully saving money in a college fund for Emma, contributing every spare dollar to ensure she'd have opportunities I'd never had. After 8 years of disciplined saving, the account had reached $23,000, not enough for a full college education, but a solid foundation. I'd withdrawn every penny and used it to cover Dad's initial treatment cost, telling the hospital billing department that the family would handle the payments privately. I'd never told Dad where the money came from, simply explaining that it had been taken care of. What I found in Dad's safe showed that he'd figured it out anyway. There was a letter from the hospital thanking the Matthews family for the prompt payment, with a note that the funds had come from Sarah Matthews' personal account. Dad had apparently requested details about the payment and learned that I'd been the one to cover his medical expenses. Below that was a handwritten note from Dad, dated just a week after his first chemotherapy session. Sarah used Emma's college fund to pay for my treatment. Em and Jay claimed they couldn't help. She sacrificed her daughter's future for my life without being asked, without expecting thanks, without telling me what it cost her. I've been a fool. There were bank records showing that Dad had tried to reimburse me several times, transferring money to an account he thought was mine. When those transfers were returned because he'd had the wrong account number, he'd apparently decided to find another way to pay me back. The next document was a copy of his original will, dated 5 years ago. In that version, his estate was divided equally among his 3 children, with small additional bequests for Emma's education. But stapled to it was a handwritten amendment dated just 2 weeks after my payment for his medical treatment. Given Sarah's sacrifice and her siblings' refusal to help during my illness, I'm reconsidering the distribution of my estate. Sarah demonstrated the character and selflessness that I'd hoped to instill in all my children. She acted like family when her siblings acted like strangers. The amendment had never been implemented. That would come months later with the completely rewritten will, but it showed that my payment for his medical care had been the turning point in Dad's understanding of who his children really were. I found more evidence of how that moment had changed his perspective. There were notes in his handwriting documenting conversations with Michael and Jennifer during his treatment period. Michael had visited twice in the 3 months, both times to ask for additional funding for his restaurant. Jennifer had visited more frequently but spent most of her time talking about her own stress and asking Dad to help her find a therapist to deal with her anxiety about his illness. Meanwhile, I'd been there for every appointment, every treatment session, every moment when he was too weak to drive himself home. I'd arranged my work schedule around his medical needs, brought him meals when he was too nauseated to cook, and stayed overnight during the worst periods of his chemotherapy cycles. The thing that had apparently meant the most to him was learning about the financial sacrifice I'd made. In his notes, he'd written, "Sarah gave up her daughter's future for my life. Michael and Jennifer wouldn't even give up a dinner out." What kind of father raises children who measure love in dollars while one child measures it in sacrifice? There was another note, dated 6 months later. Told the kids today that I'm cancer-free. Michael immediately asked if this meant he could proceed with the expansion plans for the restaurant. Jennifer wanted to plan a celebration party at my expense. Sarah just hugged me and cried. She was the only one who seemed to care about my health more than my money. The final document in the folder was the most heartbreaking. It was a check for $23,000 made out to Emma Matthews, with a memo line that read, "College fund return of grandfather's debt." The check was dated just a month before Dad died, but it had never been sent. Attached was a note, "Sarah, you gave your daughter's future to save my life. I can never adequately repay that sacrifice, but I can ensure that Emma has the education she deserves, and you have the security I should have offered you years ago. You proved that family isn't about blood or obligation, it's about love. You were the only one who loved me more than my money." I sat in Dad's study, holding that unsent, check and crying for the relationship we'd never quite managed to have while he was alive. He'd seen my sacrifice, understood its meaning, and tried to honor it in the only way he knew how. But his pride and his inability to express emotion had prevented him from simply telling me what it meant to him. Instead, he'd rewritten his will, ensuring that the daughter who'd proven her love through sacrifice would inherit the bulk of his estate, while the children who'd seen him only as a source of funds would receive token amounts. It wasn't revenge, it was recognition. He'd finally understood the difference between children who needed him and a child who loved him. The cruelest irony was that if he'd just thanked me at the time, if he'd acknowledged what I'd done and why it mattered, maybe we could have had a real relationship in his final years. Instead, he carried the knowledge of my sacrifice in silence, letting it change his will, but never letting it change our daily interactions. But perhaps that was fitting for our family love expressed through actions rather than words. Understanding reached too late for healing, but just in time for justice. Hidden in the bottom drawer of Dad's desk, beneath a stack of old tax returns, I found a manila envelope marked Sarah Personal. Inside were dozens of letters he'd written to me over the years, but never sent. Each one was a window into the internal struggle of a man who desperately wanted to connect with his daughter, but didn't know how. The earliest letter was dated 15 years ago, right after my divorce. Dear Sarah, I heard about you and David splitting up. I know I'm probably the last person you want advice from, but I wanted you to know that I don't think you failed. Marriage is hard, and sometimes two good people just aren't right for each other. I'm sorry I wasn't more supportive when you told me you were pregnant. I was scared for you, scared you'd end up struggling the way your mother and I did when we were young. But watching you handle this divorce with such grace, I realize you're stronger than I ever gave you credit for. You don't need David or anyone else to take care of you. You never did. Love, Dad. The letter was written on his personal stationery in his careful handwriting, but it had never left his desk. Instead, I remembered him saying something about making my bed when I told him about the divorce. How different things might have been if he'd sent this letter instead. Another letter was dated after Emma's birth. Sarah, I saw Emma for the first time today, and she's perfect. She has your eyes and your stubborn chin, the same one you used to jut out at me when I criticized you as a child. I was wrong to be so hard on you. I thought if I set impossible standards, you'd always strive to be better. But all I did was make you doubt yourself when you should have been proud of your achievements. Watching you with Emma, seeing how naturally loving and patient you are, I realized that you turned out exactly as you should have despite my parenting, not because of it. I hope Emma knows how lucky she is to have you as a mother. Love, Dad. Again, never sent. Instead, I remembered his cold response to Emma's birth, his comment about another mouth to feed, and his suggestion that I should have thought harder about having a child I couldn't afford. The letters continued chronologically, marking moments where Dad had wanted to reach out but hadn't found the courage. When I graduated with my master's degree, when I received recognition at work, when I bought my small house, each milestone had prompted another unsent letter of pride and apology. One letter, written after he'd attended one of Emma's school plays, was particularly touching. Sarah, Emma was wonderful tonight. She has your creativity and your warmth. When she was on stage, I kept thinking about how you used to perform little shows for us when you were her age. I should have encouraged that creativity instead of telling you to focus on practical things. I should have told you that watching you dance around the living room was one of my favorite parts of coming home from work. I robbed both of us of so much joy by being afraid to seem soft. I'm sorry, love, Dad. The most revealing letters were the ones written during his illness. As his cancer progressed, his writing had become more urgent, more desperate to communicate things he'd kept locked inside for decades. Sarah, I'm dying, and I need you to understand something. You were never the disappointment. You were the success story I was too proud to acknowledge. Michael and Jennifer are good people, but they needed me to succeed. You succeeded despite me. Every time I criticized you, every time I withheld praise or support, you found a way to prove your worth through your own efforts. I turned you into the strongest person in our family by refusing to be your strength. I don't know if that was wisdom or cruelty, but I know you're better for it. Another late letter was even more direct. I've been thinking about the money you spent on my medical treatment. You gave up Emma's college fund for me money you'd saved working 2 jobs. Money that represented years of sacrifice and hope. Michael and Jennifer couldn't spare a dime to help save my life, but you gave up your daughter's future without hesitation. That's when I knew which of my children truly loved me. Love isn't about saying the right words or showing up to family dinners. Love is about sacrifice. You're the only one who ever sacrificed anything for me. The final letters, written in the last months of his life, showed a man wrestling with regret and trying to find a way to make amends. Sarah, I changed my will today. You're getting most of everything. And Michael and Jennifer are going to hate.
You for it?
They'll say you manipulated me, that you took advantage of a sick old man. Let them think that. Let them believe whatever they need to believe. The truth is that you earned this inheritance through 30 years of loving me despite my inability to love you back properly. You deserve this money not because you need it, but because you never asked for it. In another late letter he'd written, I know you think I don't love you. I know my words at the hospital hurt you. I said those things because I needed your siblings to believe them. When they find out about the will, they'll contest it. They'll claim you influenced me. But if they think I died hating you, they can't. Argue that you manipulated me through false affection. My cruelty was my final gift to you, protection from their inevitable accusations. Reading this, I finally understood why his final words had been so devastating. It hadn't been a moment of true feeling. It had been a performance designed to protect me from exactly what was happening now. He'd sacrificed our last conversation to give me legal cover for his decision. The last letter in the pile was unfinished. Written in increasingly shaky handwriting. Sarah, I hope someday you'll find these letters and understand what I couldn't say out loud. I was never good with words, never good at showing emotion. Your mother used to say I had the emotional range of a fence post, and she wasn't wrong. But please know that every harsh word I spoke to you came from love misguided, poorly expressed love, but love nonetheless. I wanted you to be strong enough to survive in a world that wouldn't always be kind to you. I wanted you to value yourself instead of depending on others for validation. I wanted you to be nothing like me, and you're not. You're everything I should have been, but was too afraid to try. You're the best of your mother and the best of me, with none of our weaknesses. I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you. I just never knew how to say it. Love, Dad. The letter ended mid-sentence, his handwriting trailing off as if he'd been interrupted or overcome with emotion. I sat surrounded by 3 decades of unspoken love, holding evidence of a relationship that had existed entirely in my father's heart and mind, but never in our actual interactions. He'd been carrying on a loving conversation with me for years, but only on paper, only in private, only in letters he'd been too proud or too afraid to send. If he'd mailed even one of these letters, our relationship could have been completely different. If he'd found the courage to speak even a fraction of these words out loud, we could have had the connection I'd spent my entire life craving. But perhaps this was better in a way. These letters showed me that his love had been constant, even when his expression of it had been absent. They proved that every harsh word, every criticism, every moment of withholding affection had tortured him as much as it had wounded me. He loved me desperately and showed it terribly. And now I had the proof of both. After discovering Dad's hidden letters, I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling from the revelation that my entire understanding of our relationship had been wrong. I'd spent 34 years believing my father saw me as a disappointment, when, in reality, I'd been the child he was most proud of. He'd just never found a way to tell me Emma was at her friend's house for a sleepover, which was fortunate because I needed time to process what I'd learned. I sat in my quiet living room, surrounded by photocopies of Dad's letters, trying to reconcile the loving father who had written these words with the critical, distant man I'd known. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how his harsh treatment had actually shaped me into the person he described in his letters. Every time he'd refused to help me financially, I'd learned to be more resourceful. Every time he criticized my choices, I developed stronger convictions about my values. Every time he'd withheld praise, I'd learned to find validation from. Within Dot, it was twisted, but effective. While Michael and Jennifer had grown up expecting Dad's money to solve their problems, I'd grown up expecting to solve my own problems. While they'd learned to see Dad as a source of financial security, I'd learned to create my own security. While they'd remained dependent on his approval and support, I'd become genuinely independent. But the emotional cost had been enormous. I thought about all the times I doubted myself, all the nights I cried myself to sleep wondering why I wasn't good enough for my father's love. I thought about the relationships I'd sabotaged because I didn't believe I deserved affection. The opportunities I passed up because I didn't think I was worthy of success. I'd spent years in therapy, working through the damage of growing up with a father who seemed incapable of expressing love. I'd learned to set boundaries, to recognize my own worth, to stop seeking validation from people who couldn't give it. Now I was discovering that the man I'd been protecting myself from had actually loved me deeply. He'd just been protecting me too. In his own misguided way. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was my therapist, Dr. Rodriguez, returning a call I'd made earlier. "Sarah, you sounded upset in your message. How are you handling everything with your father's estate?" I'd been seeing Dr. Rodriguez for 3 years, working through family issues and learning to build healthy relationships. She knew all about my complicated feelings regarding Dad. "I found some things in his house today," I said, my voice shaky. Letters he wrote to me but never sent. Hundreds of them, going back years. They completely changed everything I thought I knew about our relationship. What kind of letters? Love letters, essentially. Apologies, expressions of pride, explanations for why he treated me the way he did. He kept every achievement of mine that I thought he'd ignored. He documented every sacrifice I made that I thought he hadn't noticed. Dr. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. "How are you feeling about these discoveries?" "Angry," I said immediately. "Confused. Sad. If he felt all these things, why couldn't he just tell me? Why did he let me spend 30 years thinking he didn't care about me?" What do you think the answer to that question might be? I'd learned that Dr. Rodriguez rarely gave direct answers, preferring to help me work through things myself. I think he was afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of seeming weak. He was from a generation where men didn't express emotions, especially tender ones. And what else? I thought about the letters, about the patterns I'd noticed in his explanations. I think he genuinely believed that being harsh would make me stronger. He thought if he gave me love and support, I'd become dependent like Michael and Jennifer. So he withheld both, thinking it would force me to develop my own strength. And did it? Yes, I admitted. I'm stronger because of how he treated me. I'm more independent, more resourceful, more self-reliant. But I'm also more guarded, more afraid of trusting people, more likely to assume I'm not worthy of love. So, his approach had both positive and negative consequences. Right, and now I don't know how to feel about any of it. Do I forgive him because his intentions were good? Do I stay angry because his methods were harmful? Do I grieve for the relationship we never had, or celebrate the relationship we apparently did have, but I never knew about? Maybe you don't have to choose, Dr. Rodriguez suggested. Maybe you can hold all of those feelings simultaneously. Maybe your father was both loving and harmful, both wise and misguided, both protective and damaging. That's what makes this so hard, I said. It would be easier if he'd just been a bad father. Then I could be purely angry. But he was a father who loved me desperately and expressed it terribly, and I don't know what to do with that. What would you want to say to him if he were here now? I thought about that for a long moment. I'd want to tell him that I forgive him for being afraid to love me out loud, but I can't forgive him for letting me believe I wasn't worth loving. I'd want to tell him that his methods worked, I am strong, but they also hurt me in ways that took years to heal. And what would you want him to know about you? That I loved him too. That I would have loved him just as much if he'd been gentle with me. That his harshness wasn't necessary. I was already motivated to succeed, already determined to be independent. He could have supported me and still raised a strong daughter. Those are important realizations, Sarah. What are you going to do with them? I don't know yet. I'm supposed to be fighting a legal battle with my siblings over his inheritance, but now I'm wondering if that's what he really wanted. Maybe he wanted me to understand him, not just inherit his money. What feels right to you?
Fighting for.
The inheritance feels right, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. Not because I need the money, but because it represents his final attempt to show me love. If I let Michael and Jennifer take it away, I'm letting them erase. His last gift to me. After we hung up, I sat with the childhood drawing I'd found in Dad's desk. The stick figure family with my hero daddy written across the top. On the back in his handwriting, before I forgot how to be the hero she thought I was. I realized that he'd never stopped being my hero, he'd just become a more complicated one. The father who'd pushed me away had also given me the strength to stand on my own. The man who'd withheld praise had taught me to value my own opinion more than others' approval. The parent who'd seemed incapable of love had loved me enough to sacrifice. Our relationship to make me stronger, Dot, it was a twisted kind of heroism, but it was heroism nonetheless. I thought about Emma, asleep at her friend's house, and what kind of parent I wanted to be to her. I didn't want to repeat Dad's mistakes. I wanted to be able to tell her I loved her, to praise her achievements, to support her dreams. But I also wanted to raise her with the strength and independence that Dad's harsh methods had given me. Maybe. The answer was finding a middle ground, loving her openly while still challenging her to be her best self. Maybe I could give her both the emotional security I'd craved and the inner strength Dad had forced me to develop. Dot, as I prepared for bed, I made a decision. I was going to fight for Dad's inheritance, but not just for the money. I was going to fight for the recognition it represented, for the validation of 30 years of unacknowledged love, for the right to finally be seen as the daughter Dad had always been proud of but never told. Michael and Jennifer could contest the will all they wanted. They could hire expensive lawyers and make their claims about manipulation and mental incompetence. But I had something they didn't. I had the truth about who Dad really was and what he really valued. Dot, and for the first time in my life, I felt worthy of fighting for his love. The legal papers arrived by courier on a Friday morning, just as Emma was finishing her breakfast before school. The envelope bore the letterhead of Whitman, Burke and Associates, Michael's high-powered law firm, and contained exactly what I expected, a formal contest of Dad's will. In the matter of the estate of Robert James Matthews, deceased. The document began. The undersigned petitioners, Michael Robert Matthews and Jennifer Lynn Matthews, hereby contest the validity of the purported last will and testament dated 6 months prior to decedent's death. Emma looked up from her cereal. What's that, Mom? Just some legal stuff about Grandpa's will, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about. But as I read through the allegations, I felt my stomach tighten. Michael and Jennifer weren't just claiming that Dad had been mentally incompetent. They were painting me as a calculating manipulator who had taken advantage of a dying man's vulnerability. The petitioners alleged that Sarah Elizabeth Matthews exerted undue influence over the decedent during his final illness. I read. Side influence included, but was not limited to, isolating the decedent from his other children, providing financial assistance in exchange for testamentary benefits, and exploiting the decedent's diminished mental capacity due to pain medication and terminal illness. The legal language was cold and clinical, but the accusations were devastating. According to my siblings' version of events, I had systematically isolated Dad from Michael and Jennifer, making myself indispensable while poisoning him against his other children. The money I'd spent on his medical treatment was characterized not as a sacrifice, but as an investment in my inheritance prospects. They'd done their homework. The filing included detailed timelines of Dad's medical treatments, documentation of his pain medication regimen, and statements from witnesses who would testify to his confusion and disorientation during his final months. They'd even found a nurse from the hospital who remembered Dad calling Jennifer by her mother's name during one particularly difficult day. But what hurt most were the personal attacks. They claimed I had a pattern of emotional manipulation and boundary violations stemming from my work as a social worker. They suggested that my training in family dynamics had given me special insight into how to exploit vulnerable elderly individuals. They painted my presence during Dad's illness not as devotion, but as opportunistic calculation. Ms. Matthews' professional background in social work, the document stated, provided her with specialized knowledge of how to manipulate family relationships and exploit psychological vulnerabilities. Her consistent presence during the decedent's illness, while his other children maintained appropriate emotional boundaries, gave her unparalleled access and opportunity to influence his testamentary decisions. The implication was clear. Michael and Jennifer had stayed away from Dad's sickbed out of healthy self-preservation. While I had swooped in like a vulture to take advantage of his weakness, I called Mr. Harrison immediately. I was expecting this. He said calmly after I'd summarized the filing, "Your siblings have hired one of the most aggressive estate litigation firms in the state. They're not playing around. Can they win? I mean, do they have a case? Every will contest has some merit, or lawyers wouldn't take them on contingency. But their case has significant weaknesses. Your father was evaluated by multiple medical professionals during the period when he changed his will. All of those evaluations show clear mental competency. What about the undue influence claims? Those are harder to disprove because they're essentially arguing about your motivations and your father's state of mind. But we have advantages they don't know about yet." "What do you mean?" "The letters you found in your father's house, the ones he wrote but never sent, they establish a clear pattern of his thinking about you and your siblings over many years. They show that his decision to change the will wasn't sudden or influenced by his illness, but was the culmination of decades of observation and reflection." I felt a surge of relief. So those letters can be used as evidence? Absolutely. They're in his handwriting, dated over multiple years, and they demonstrate his genuine feelings about each of his children. No court is going to believe that you somehow forced him to write dozens of loving letters to you over a 15-year period. What happens next? We have 30 days to file a response. I'll need you to compile all the evidence you found in your father's house, the letters, the financial records showing your siblings' dependencies, the documentation of your payment for his medical treatment. We're going to tell the complete story of your family's dynamics, not just the version your siblings want the court to hear. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen thinking about the battle ahead. Michael and Jennifer had resources I didn't expensive. Lawyers, financial flexibility, and a lifetime of confidence that they deserved whatever they wanted. But I had something more powerful. The truth. The phone rang again. It was Jennifer, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Sarah, I just wanted you to know that this isn't personal. We're just trying to honor Dad's real wishes." His real wishes are spelled out pretty clearly in his will. Come on, Sarah, you know that will doesn't reflect what Dad really wanted. He was sick, confused, on heavy pain medication. You took advantage of that. I took care of him when you wouldn't. You monopolized him. You made yourself indispensable and then used that access to manipulate him.
That's not love, Sarah. That's not love, Sarah. That's not love.
Exploitation. Is that really what you think happened? I think you saw an opportunity and you took it. Dad always felt guilty about how he treated you, and you used that guilt to get him to change his will. It's actually pretty clever if you think about it. The casual cruelty of her words took my breath away. Jennifer, I never asked Dad for anything. I never even knew about this will until after he died. Right. And I suppose you also had no idea. That paying for his medical treatment might make him feel obligated to you. I paid for his treatment because he needed it, and you and Michael refused to help. We refused to enable your martyr complex. You've always thrived on being the victim. Sarah, this is just the most extreme example. I'm hanging up now. Wait, Sarah, it doesn't have to be this way. We could settle this quietly. We're not trying to leave you with nothing, we just want what's fair. Dad always intended for Michael and me to inherit the bulk of his estate. You know that. What are you proposing? Keep the house. It's worth about $400,000. Michael and I will split the rest of the investments. The business assets, the cash. Everyone gets something. Nobody gets everything. It's fair. I almost laughed. So you want me to give up $1.4 million in exchange for not having to go to court? You'd be giving up money that was never really meant for you anyway. And you'd be preserving what's left of our family relationships. What family relationships? You've spent the last week accusing me of elder abuse. That's just legal strategy, Sarah. We don't really think you're a bad person. We just think you made some questionable choices during a very difficult time. I made the choice to be there for our father when you weren't. And now you want to be rewarded for that choice with his entire life's work. Don't you see how that looks? I thought about Dad's letters, about his clear explanations for why he'd made this decision. It looks like a father finally recognizing which of his children actually loved him. The conversation ended badly, with Jennifer warning me that the court battle would get ugly, and that I should prepare for my personal life to be scrutinized in ways I wouldn't enjoy after she hung up. I looked at Emma's school photo on the refrigerator and made a silent promise. I was going to fight this contest with everything I had, not just for the money, but for the principle. Dad had made his choice with a clear mind and a full understanding of who his children were. I wasn't going to let Michael and Jennifer rewrite that truth just because they didn't like the outcome. The legal battle was about to begin, and I was ready for war. The first unexpected call came from Henry Williamson, Dad's business partner of 25 years. I met him a few times at family gatherings, but we'd never had a real conversation. His voice was warm but determined when he introduced himself. Sarah, I heard about the will contest your siblings filed. I wanted you to know that's complete nonsense, and I'm prepared to testify on your behalf if it comes to that. Mr. Williamson, that's very kind, but I don't want to drag you into our family drama. This isn't drama. It's justice. Your father talked about you constantly, especially in the last few years. He was incredibly proud of you, and he was increasingly frustrated with Michael and Jennifer's behavior. He talked about me all the time. He used to show me articles about your work with troubled families. He kept a folder in his desk at the office with every recognition you'd ever received. He'd tell anyone who would listen about how you'd built a successful life without any help from him. This was news to me. I'd assumed Dad's pride in my achievements existed only in those unsent letters. He also talked about Michael and Jennifer's financial problems, Henry continued. He was deeply concerned about their inability to manage money. He used to say that giving them inheritance would be like throwing money into a black hole. Would you be willing to put that in writing? Already done. I've prepared a detailed statement about your father's mental state during his final years, his clear understanding of his children's different characters, and his specific concerns about Michael and Jennifer's financial irresponsibility. Your father was one of the sharpest businessmen I knew right up until the day he died. The second surprise came from Mrs. Chun, Dad's elderly neighbor. She knocked on my door Saturday morning with a plate of homemade cookies and a story that brought tears to my eyes. Your father used to sit on his porch in the evenings, she said in her careful English. We would talk sometimes. He always talked about you and Emma. He did? Oh, yes. He was so proud when Emma learned to ride bicycle. He showed me video on his phone many times. And when you got promotion at work, he told me you were helping families just like angels help people. I was stunned. He had videos of Emma on his phone? Many videos. You send them to him, yes? Birthday parties, school plays, swimming lessons. He watched them over and over. Sometimes I see him crying happy tears. Mrs. Chun, would you be willing to tell a lawyer about these conversations? Of course. Your brother and sister, they never come to visit your father, only when they need money. I hear them sometimes arguing about business, asking for checks. But you come with Emma, bring groceries, stay to have dinner. Real family. The third ally was completely unexpected. Dr. Patricia Morrison, Dad's oncologist. She called me directly after learning about the will contest from Mr. Harrison. Ms. Matthews, I understand there are questions about your father's mental competency during his final months. I wanted to offer my professional assessment for your legal proceedings. Doctor, I appreciate that, but aren't there confidentiality issues? Your father signed releases allowing me to discuss his care with family members. And frankly, the allegations in this lawsuit are so far from the medical reality that I feel obligated to correct the record. What can you tell me? Your father remained mentally sharp throughout his treatment. Yes, he was on pain medication, but nothing that would impair his judgment or decision-making capacity. I evaluated his cognitive function regularly as part of his care protocol. He scored in the normal range on every assessment. What about the incident where he called Jennifer by my mother's name?
That happened once.
During a particularly difficult chemotherapy session when he was experiencing severe nausea and dehydration. It lasted about 10 minutes, and he was completely lucid before and after. One episode of mild confusion during intensive medical treatment is not evidence of dementia or incompetence. Would you testify to that in court? Absolutely. I've already prepared my medical records for your attorney. Your father knew exactly what he was doing when he made his end-of-life decisions. The most moving support came from an unexpected source. Emma's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez. She called to ask about Emma's recent behavior and ended up offering crucial insight into Dad's relationship with his granddaughter. Emma talks about her grandfather all the time, Mrs. Rodriguez said. She told the class about how he taught her to play chess, how he helped her with her science project, how he came to her school play even though he was sick.
He did all that.
She has a whole collection of things he gave her: books, art supplies, a telescope for stargazing. She said he told her she was going to be a scientist someday and that he was saving money for her college.
I felt a stab of guilt.
I'd been so focused on my own complicated relationship with Dad that I'd missed the simple, loving relationship he'd built with Emma. While he'd struggled to express affection to me directly, he'd apparently had no trouble showering love on his granddaughter. Mrs. Rodriguez, did Emma ever mention her uncles visiting? Never. She talks about you and her grandfather, but I don't think I've ever heard her mention other family members. She did say once that her grandfather was sad because some people in the family didn't like to visit. Even the practical support was overwhelming. Dad's accountant, Margaret Santos, called to offer her services free of charge for the duration of the legal proceedings. Your father was a meticulous record keeper, she said. I have 15 years of documentation showing the money he gave to Michael and Jennifer versus the money he received from you. The financial picture tells a very clear story about who supported whom in your family. What kind of documentation? Everything. Copies of every check he wrote to your siblings, records of every business loan he co-signed, documentation of every debt he paid off on their behalf. I also have the records of the money you paid for his medical treatment, including the bank transfer showing it came from Emma's college fund. You knew about that? Your father asked me to track it down. He wanted to understand exactly where the money had come from. When he learned you'd emptied your daughter's college fund to pay for his chemotherapy, he was devastated. That's when he first talked to me about changing his will. By the end of the week, I had a team of people ready to testify on Dad's behalf and mine. His business partner, his doctor, his neighbor, his accountant, and several family friends who had witnessed his frustration with Michael and Jennifer's behavior over the years. More importantly, I had evidence that Dad's love for me hadn't been hidden as completely as I'd thought. While he'd struggled to express it directly, he'd shared his pride in my achievements with others. He'd kept videos of Emma on his phone, bragged about my work to his neighbors, and maintained detailed records of our family's financial dynamics. The picture that emerged was of a man who understood his children's characters perfectly and made his final decisions based on decades of careful observation. The will contest suddenly seemed less like a legal battle and more like an attempt by Michael and Jennifer to rewrite a story that Dad had spent years documenting. Mr. Harrison was delighted when I shared these developments with him. Your siblings? Lawyers are probably expecting this to be a he said, she said situation, he said. They're not prepared for the mountain of evidence we're about to present. Your father may not have been good at expressing love directly, but he was excellent at documenting the truth. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt confident that justice would prevail. Dad had left me more than money he'd left. Emmy proved that his decision had been based on a lifetime of watching, learning, and understanding who his children really were. The medical records that Dr. Morrison provided painted a clear picture of Dad's mental state during his final months, and they completely contradicted Michael and Jennifer's claims about his incompetence. The documentation was thorough and professional, the kind of evidence that would be difficult for any court to dismiss. Dr. Morrison had conducted regular cognitive assessments as part of Dad's cancer treatment protocol. These weren't casual observations. They were formal evaluations using standardized testing instruments designed to detect mental impairment in elderly patients. The results showed that Dad's cognitive function remained within normal ranges throughout his treatment. Patient demonstrates excellent recall, logical reasoning, and decision-making capacity, one assessment noted. Shows clear understanding of treatment options and their implications. Able to discuss complex financial and family matters coherently and consistently. The assessments were particularly detailed during the period when Dad had changed his will. 6 months before his death, when he'd met with Mr. Harrison to rewrite his testament, Dad had scored 28 out of 30 on the mini mental state examination, well within the normal range for his age group. Patient expresses concern about family dynamics and estate planning, Dr. Morrison had noted after one appointment. Demonstrates clear understanding of his children's different financial situations and character traits. Discusses his testamentary intentions with full awareness of potential family conflicts. The medical records also address the pain medication issue that Michael and Jennifer's lawyers were emphasizing. While Dad had been prescribed opioid painkillers during his treatment, the dosages were carefully managed and monitored. More importantly, the records showed that he'd often requested lower doses than prescribed, preferring to maintain mental clarity even if it meant experiencing more discomfort. Patient consistently chooses mental acuity over pain relief. Dr. Morrison had written, frequently refuses additional pain medication, stating he wants to keep his wits about him for important family and business decisions. The one incident that Michael and Jennifer were highlighting when Dad had briefly called Jennifer by her mother's name was thoroughly documented in the medical records. It had occurred during a severe reaction to a new chemotherapy drug that had caused temporary dehydration and disorientation. The episode lasted exactly 12 minutes and was preceded and followed by completely normal cognitive function. Patient experienced brief confusion during adverse drug reaction. The notes read, full orientation and mental clarity restored within 15 minutes of IV fluid administration. No lasting cognitive effects observed. Dr. Morrison had also documented Dad's emotional state during his final months, and these observations were particularly damaging to my sibling's case. Rather than showing a confused elderly man susceptible to manipulation, the records revealed someone who was increasingly clear about his family relationships and his legacy wishes. Patient expresses frustration with adult children's financial dependence. One note read, states that 2 of his children see him as a bank account rather than a father. Contrasts this with daughter who sacrificed her own financial security for his medical care. Another entry was even more specific. Patient discusses while planning extensively. Demonstrates clear understanding of each child's character and financial history. States intention to reward responsibility and sacrifice rather than expectations and entitlement. Mr. Harrison arranged for me to meet with Dr. Morrison to review her findings in detail. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes, the sort of physician who inspired confidence through competence rather than charm. Your father was one of my most mentally engaged patients, she told me. Even during the worst periods of his treatment, he remained focused on his family's future and his own legacy decisions. What about the medication effects that my siblings are claiming? Pain medication can certainly affect judgment in some patients, but your father was unusually resistant to those effects. He actually frustrated some of our nurses because he would refuse adequate pain relief to maintain his mental clarity. So there's no medical basis for claiming he was incompetent? None whatsoever. In fact, I'd argue that your father's cognitive function during his final months was remarkably sharp for someone facing terminal illness. He was processing complex emotional and financial information with the same clarity he'd shown throughout his treatment. Dr. Morrison had also prepared a formal psychiatric evaluation that specifically addressed the competency question. She'd brought in Dr. James Liu, a geriatric psychiatrist, to conduct an independent assessment of Dad's mental state. 2 months before his death, well after he'd changed his will. Dr. Liu's evaluation was comprehensive and damning to Michael and Jennifer's case. He'd conducted extensive interviews with Dad, administered multiple cognitive tests, and reviewed his complete medical history. His conclusion was unequivocal. Patient demonstrates excellent cognitive function, clear reasoning ability, and full competence to make financial and legal decisions. The psychiatric evaluation had actually been Dad's idea. According to Dr. Morrison, he'd specifically requested it because he wanted documentation of his mental competence for estate planning purposes. Your father told me he was concerned that his other children might challenge his will, Dr. Morrison explained. He said he wanted medical proof that his decisions were made with a clear mind. He anticipated the contest? He absolutely anticipated it. He told me that Michael and Jennifer had grown accustomed to his financial support and would be shocked to learn about the will changes. He wanted to ensure there was no question about his mental capacity. This revelation was stunning. Dad hadn't just made his will changes in secret. He'd actively prepared for the legal challenge he knew would follow. He gathered medical evidence, documented his reasoning, and created a paper trail that would protect his final wishes from exactly the kind of contest my siblings had filed. The medical evidence package that Dr. Morrison provided to Mr. Harrison was devastating to Michael and Jennifer's case. It included 15 months of cognitive assessments, showing consistent mental competence, detailed documentation of Dad's pain medication usage and his preference for mental clarity, psychiatric evaluation, specifically addressing his testamentary capacity, medical notes documenting his clear reasoning about family dynamics, records showing he had specifically requested competency documentation for estate planning. This is exactly what we needed. Mr. Harrison told me after reviewing the medical evidence, your siblings' lawyers are building their case around the assumption that your father was a confused, medicated old man who didn't understand what he was doing. These records prove the opposite. He was extraordinarily deliberate and well-informed about his decisions. What happens when they see this evidence? They'll probably try to find their own medical experts to contradict it, but that's difficult when the documentation is this thorough and contemporaneous. They might also shift their strategy to focus more heavily on the undue influence claims, since the mental incompetence argument just became much weaker. I felt a profound sense of vindication reading through Dad's medical records. Even in his final months facing death and dealing with intense physical pain, he'd been thinking about his family's future and taking steps to protect his final wishes. He'd anticipated every argument my siblings might make and had systematically gathered evidence to counter their claims. More than that, the medical records showed that his decision to change his will hadn't been impulsive or emotion-driven. It had been the result of careful consideration and clear-headed analysis of his children's characters and behaviors. The father I thought was distant and unobservant had actually been watching us all very carefully, and he made his final decisions based on decades of accumulated evidence about who we really were. The medical documentation was proof that Dad's last will and testament represented his true wishes, made with full mental capacity and complete understanding of the consequences. Michael and Jennifer could claim whatever they wanted about manipulation and confusion, but the medical evidence told a different story. The story of a dying man who'd used his final months to ensure that his legacy went to the child who had proven herself worthy of it. Mr. Harrison's suggestion to hire a private investigator initially made me uncomfortable. It felt like stooping to Michael and Jennifer's level, digging up dirt to use in a family fight. But when he explained what we were looking for, I understood. The necessity. We need to document the financial history between your father and your siblings, he said. Their lawyers are going to paint them as loving children who were unfairly cut out of their inheritance. We need to show the court the real financial dynamics of your family. The investigator he recommended was Sarah Cheen, no relation to Dad's neighbor, a former FBI agent who specialized in financial investigations. She was a small, efficient woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner that inspired confidence. I've reviewed the initial documentation he provided, she told me during our first meeting. Your siblings' financial relationship with your father appears to have been quite complex. I'd like to dig deeper into the business dealings, the loan arrangements, and their current financial situations.
Is that legal?
Everything I'll be researching is part of the public record court filings. Business registrations, property records, bankruptcy filings. I'm not hacking into anyone's personal accounts. I'm just assembling information that's already available to anyone who knows where to look. What Sarah uncovered over the next 2 weeks was more extensive than even I had suspected. Her preliminary report read like a financial disaster manual documenting years of failed investments, defaulted loans, and increasingly desperate attempts by my siblings to maintain lifestyles they couldn't afford. Michael's business history was particularly damaging. The private investigator had traced not just the ventures Dad had funded, but also the ones he tried to launch independently. There had been at least 8 different business entities registered under Michael's name over the past 15 years, and every single one had failed within 2 years. More troubling was the pattern of how these businesses had failed. Several had left significant debts to vendors and employees that Michael had simply walked away from. 3 different companies had been dissolved, while owing back taxes to the IRS. 2 had resulted in lawsuits from business partners, who claimed Michael had misrepresented his financial backing. Your brother appears to have a pattern of using your father's reputation to secure business relationships, then defaulting when the promised family funding doesn't materialize, Sarah explained. I found at least 6 instances where business partners specifically mentioned their willingness to work with Michael because of his father's financial backing. The investigation also revealed that Michael was currently in much more serious financial trouble than I'd realized. He had 3 separate judgments against him totaling over $200,000. His credit score was in the low 400s, and he'd been living in a rental property for the past 2 years because he'd lost his house to foreclosure. The expensive suits and car are leased, Sarah noted. He's maintaining an appearance of success while essentially being insolvent. The inheritance from your father's estate isn't just something he wants. It's something he desperately needs to avoid bankruptcy. Jennifer's situation was different but equally troubling. The gambling problem that Dad's financial records had suggested was much more serious than I'd imagined. Sarah had found evidence of debts to multiple casinos, online gambling sites, and what appeared to be illegal bookmakers. Your sister has been banned from 3 different casinos in the past 2 years, Sarah reported. She owes approximately $80,000 to various gambling establishments, and there's evidence she's been borrowing money at extremely high interest rates to cover her losses. The investigation revealed that Jennifer had been using multiple credit cards and personal loans to fund her gambling habit, always staying just ahead of the collection agencies. She'd also been borrowing money from friends and family members, people other than Dad, with promises to repay them from her inheritance. She's essentially been living on borrowed money for the past 3 years, Sarah explained. She told several creditors that she was expecting a large inheritance that would allow her to pay off all her debts. The will contest isn't just about family fairness for her, it's about financial survival. Perhaps most damaging was what the investigation revealed about my siblings' relationship with Dad during his final years. Sarah had interviewed several of his friends, neighbors, and business associates, and their accounts painted a picture that directly contradicted Michael and Jennifer's claims about being loving, attentive children. Multiple witnesses describe your siblings visiting your father primarily when they needed money, Sarah reported. Several people mentioned that your father seemed increasingly frustrated with these interactions and would complain about feeling like an OTM rather than a parent. The business partner testimony was particularly compelling. Henry Williamson had provided detailed accounts of conversations where Dad had expressed his disappointment in Michael and Jennifer's financial irresponsibility. But Sarah had also found 3 other business associates who could testify to similar conversations. Your father apparently told multiple people that he was concerned about leaving his estate to children who had never learned to manage money responsibly, Sarah said. He specifically mentioned that you were the only one of his children who had never asked him for financial help. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Michael and Jennifer had been expecting and planning for their inheritance in ways That showed they viewed it as an entitlement rather than a gift. Jennifer had told friends she was waiting for her ship to come in when Dad died. Michael had applied for business loans using his expected inheritance as collateral. They've both been making financial decisions based on the assumption that they would inherit your father's wealth, Sarah explained. This suggests they weren't paying attention to his actual feelings about their financial habits. Most devastating was the discovery that both Michael and Jennifer had significant debts that they'd been hiding from Dad. The investigation revealed that Michael owed money to several people Dad knew professionally, creating potential embarrassment for Dad and his business community. Jennifer had borrowed money from Dad's neighbors and friends, always with stories about temporary financial difficulties that would be resolved soon. Your siblings have been trading on your father's reputation and relationships to secure credit, Sarah told me. They've essentially been damaging his standing in the community through their financial irresponsibility. The final element of Sarah's investigation focused on my own financial history, both to counter any claims about my motivations and to document the contrast of my siblings' behavior. Her research confirmed what Dad's records had already shown. I never borrowed money from him, never defaulted on any obligations, and had maintained good credit and financial stability despite being a single mother. Your financial profile shows exactly what your father apparently valued: independence, responsibility, and the ability to live within your means, Sarah concluded. While your siblings were accumulating debt and depending on family bailouts, you were building a stable life through your own efforts. When Sarah presented her complete report to Mr. Harrison, he was visibly pleased. This documentation completely undermines their claim that they were loving, responsible children who deserve equal treatment, he said. It shows that your father's will reflects a clear-eyed assessment of his children's different characters and financial capabilities. The private investigator's report would become crucial evidence in our defense against the will contest. It demonstrated that Dad's decision hadn't been based on last-minute manipulation or confusion, but on decades of observing how his children handled money, responsibility, and relationships. More importantly, it proved that Michael and Jennifer's shock at the will's contents wasn't evidence of Dad's mental incompetence. It was evidence of their own failure to understand the consequences of their actions. They'd assumed that blood relationship entitled them to inheritance regardless of their behavior, never realizing that Dad was actually paying attention to who they'd become as adults. The investigation had given us the ammunition we needed to fight the will contest, but it had also given me something more valuable: confirmation that Dad's final decisions had been based on truth rather than favoritism, justice rather than caprice. 3 weeks before the court date, Michael and Jennifer requested a family meeting. They wanted to make one final attempt at settling out of court. According to their lawyer, Mr. Harrison advised against it, but I agreed to meet them at Dad's house-neutral territory that somehow felt appropriate for our final confrontation. I arrived first and waited in Dad's living room, surrounded by furniture and memories that would soon belong to me if the court upheld his will. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was sitting in a house I'd rarely been welcomed in as a child, now fighting for the right to inherit it from a father who'd spent years making me feel unwelcome. Michael and Jennifer arrived together, both dressed as if they were attending a business meeting rather than a family discussion. Michael wore his most expensive suit, while Jennifer had chosen a conservative dress that probably cost more than I made in a month. They were putting on a show of success, even now maintaining the facade that had apparently fooled them into thinking they deserved Dad's inheritance. Sarah, Michael began without preamble, we need to talk about this situation before it gets completely out of hand. The situation is already completely out of hand. You've accused me of elder abuse and illegal filing.
That's just legal language,
Jennifer said dismissively. Our lawyers said we had to make those claims to have grounds for the contest. It's not personal. It feels pretty personal to me. Michael sat down across from me, his expression serious but not hostile. Look, Sarah, we all know this will contest is going to be expensive and ugly. Nobody wins when families fight in court. We're prepared to make you a fair offer. I'm listening. We'll give you the house and $300,000 cash, Jennifer said.
That's
More than fair for someone who was never really part of Dad's business or his long-term plans. I almost laughed at the audacity. You'll give me roughly of what Dad left me and I should be grateful? You'll get property you can actually use and enough money to secure Emma's future, Michael replied. The rest of the estate, the business assets, the investments, those require management skills and financial sophistication that you don't have. And you do? I've been working with Dad's business interests for years. Jennifer has been helping him manage his social and financial networks. We understand how to preserve and grow wealth. You understand how to help troubled families. The condescension in his voice was breathtaking. Even now, even after everything that had been revealed about their financial disasters, they still saw themselves as the competent ones and me as the charity case. Let me ask you something, I said. Do either of you actually know what Dad thought of your business skills? They exchanged a look. Dad was proud of our achievements, Jennifer said carefully. Was he? Because I found some interesting documents in his files. I pulled out copies of some of the financial records I'd discovered, including Dad's notes about Michael's failed businesses and Jennifer's gambling debts. Their faces went pale as they recognized the damaging information. He knew about all of it, I continued. Every failed business, every defaulted loan, every gambling debt. He'd been documenting your financial disasters for years. That's private information, Michael stammered. It's information he kept in his personal files, along with detailed records of every dollar he gave you and every promise you broke. Did you really think he didn't notice that you only visited when you needed money? Jennifer's composure cracked. That's not fair, Sarah. We love Dad. We just expressed it differently than you did. You expressed it by taking advantage of him. We never took advantage. Michael, you cost him $400,000 on that real estate deal alone. Jennifer, he paid off your gambling debts 3 separate times. How is that not taking advantage? Those were investments and temporary loans, Michael said defensively. I always intended to pay him back. With what? Your credit score is in the 400s. You're essentially bankrupt. How do you know that? Jennifer demanded. Because I had a private investigator, just like you did. The difference is my investigator found actual facts instead of gossip and speculation. I pulled out Sarah Chun's report and began reading selected passages about their financial situations. The color drained from both their faces as I detailed. Their debts, their failed businesses, their desperate financial circumstances. This is why Dad changed his will, I said. Not because I manipulated him, but because he finally understood who you really are. You're not successful adults who deserve to inherit his life's work. You're financial disasters who've been living off his generosity for years. Shut up, Jennifer said, her voice shaking with rage. Just shut up, Sarah. You've always been jealous of us. Always resented that Dad loved us more than you.
Did he? Did he love you more?
Because I found letters he wrote to me, dozens of them, going back years. Letters where he talked about how proud he was of my independence, how frustrated he was with your constant demands for money.
You're lying.
I pulled out photocopies of some of Dad's unsent letters and began reading passages about their financial dependence and his growing disappointment in their choices. The silence that followed was deafening. He never sent these letters, Michael said finally. No, he didn't. He kept his feelings to himself, just like he kept his observations about your behavior to himself. But he documented everything and he made his final decisions based on years of watching how each of us lived our lives. This is insane, Jennifer said, standing up abruptly. You're actually trying to convince us that Dad secretly hated us while pretending to love us? I don't think he hated you. I think he was disappointed in you. I think he loved you enough to keep supporting you financially, even when he knew you were using him. But I also think he was smart enough not to leave his life's work to people who would waste it. And you won't waste it?
Michael asked bitterly.
I won't waste it because I never needed it to begin with. I built my life without Dad's money raised. Emma, without his financial support, proved I could succeed on my own. You've never proven you can do anything without his help. The conversation deteriorated rapidly from there. Jennifer accused me of being a manipulative social worker who'd used my professional skills to exploit an elderly man. Michael threatened to drag my personal life through court proceedings, to question my fitness as a mother, to destroy my reputation in ways that would affect my career. But something had changed in me during the weeks since Dad's death. Their threats didn't scare me the way they once would have. Their accusations didn't make me doubt myself or question my worthiness. I'd spent my entire life seeking their approval and Dad's love, and now I realized I didn't need either. "Do whatever you think you have to do," I said calmly. "Drag me through court, attack my character, spend your last remaining credit on lawyer's fees. It won't change the facts." Dad made his choice with a clear mind, and he chose the child who had proven herself worthy of his trust. "This isn't over," Michael said as they prepared to leave. "Yes, it is," I replied. "It's been over for years. You just didn't realize it because you weren't paying attention to anything except your next handout." After they left, I sat alone in Dad's house for a long time, thinking about the family we'd been and the family we'd never become. The three of us would probably never speak again after the court proceedings were finished. Emma would grow up without her aunt and uncle, without the extended family connections I always hoped to provide for her. But maybe that was okay. Maybe it was better for her to have no family than to have family members who saw her as an obstacle to their inheritance, who viewed relationships in terms of financial advantage, who couldn't understand the difference between love and dependency. I was ready for court. I was ready to fight for what Dad had left me, not just because I deserved it, but because he deserved to have his final wishes respected. The confrontation with Michael and Jennifer had only confirmed what all the evidence had already shown. Dad's will reflected a clear-eyed assessment of his children's characters, and his decision to leave the bulk of his estate to me had been both justified and wise. The family meeting had accomplished exactly the opposite of what my siblings had intended. Instead of convincing me to settle for less, it had strengthened my resolve to fight for everything Dad had wanted me to have. The courthouse felt imposing on the morning of our hearing, its marble columns and formal atmosphere, a stark reminder that my family's private pain was about to become public record. I dressed conservatively in a navy suit that projected competence, without ostentation. Mr. Harrison's suggestion for conveying the right image to the judge. Michael and Jennifer were already there when I arrived, flanked by their legal team from Whitman, Burke, and Associates. They looked confident, well-funded, and determined. Their lead attorney, Richard Whitman, was a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that probably intimidated many opponents. Judge Patricia Sanderson was a woman in her 50s known for her no-nonsense approach to estate litigation. Mr. Harrison had warned me that she had little patience for family drama and would focus strictly on the legal merits of each side's arguments. "This court will hear the matter of Matthews versus Matthews," Judge Sanderson announced, regarding the contested last will and testament of Robert James Matthews, deceased. Richard Whitman rose to present the petitioner's case first. His opening statement was polished and persuasive, painting a picture of a confused elderly man who had been systematically isolated and manipulated by a calculating daughter. "Your Honor, Robert Matthews was a loving father who intended to treat his children equally in his estate plan. The will that suddenly appeared 6 months before his death represents a dramatic departure from his lifelong intentions and his previously stated wishes. This change occurred during a period when Mr. Matthews was suffering from terminal cancer, taking heavy pain medication, and increasingly dependent on the care provided by the respondent, Sarah Matthews." Whitman's presentation was methodical and damaging. He introduced evidence of Dad's pain medication prescriptions, testimony from the nurse who had witnessed his brief episode of confusion, and statements from Michael and Jennifer about Dad's previous expressions of intent to divide his estate equally. The respondent exploited her father's vulnerability during his final illness, Whitman continued. She positioned herself as his primary caregiver, isolated him from his other children, and used her professional training as a social worker to manipulate his emotions and influence his testamentary decisions. When Mr. Harrison rose to present our defense, his approach was completely different. Instead of dramatic rhetoric, he presented a methodical dismantling of every claim the petitioners had made. Your Honor, this case is not about a confused elderly man being manipulated by his scheming daughter. It's about a father who spent decades observing his children's characters and made his final decisions based on clear-eyed assessment of their worthiness to inherit his life's work. Mr. Harrison's presentation of the medical evidence was devastating too. Michael and Jennifer's case. Dr. Morrison testified about Dad's consistent mental competence throughout his treatment. Dr. Liu's psychiatric evaluation was entered into evidence, showing that Dad had specifically requested competency testing to support his estate planning decisions. Mr. Matthews wasn't confused about his children's characters, Mr. Harrison argued. He was remarkably clear-sighted about them. The financial evidence was equally compelling. Margaret Santos, Dad's accountant, testified about the detailed records Dad had kept of his children's financial histories. Henry Williamson spoke about Dad's growing frustration with Michael and Jennifer's dependence and his admiration for my independence. But the most powerful evidence was Dad's own words. Mr. Harrison introduced dozens of the letters Dad had written but never sent, reading key passages that revealed his true feelings about each of his children. I quote from a letter dated 2 years before Mr. Matthews' death. Mr. Harrison said, "Sarah is the only one of my children who never asked for money. She gave it to me instead. Michael and Jennifer see me as a bank account. Sarah sees me as a father, even when I failed to be one." The private investigator's report was introduced as evidence of Michael and Jennifer's actual financial situations versus the successful image they projected. Their mounting debts, failed businesses, and gambling problems were laid out in detail, showing that Dad's concerns about their financial irresponsibility were well-founded. Mrs. Chen, Dad's neighbor, provided touching testimony about his pride in Emma and his frustration with his other children's infrequent visits. He used to say that Sarah was the only one who came to see him, not his wallet. She testified. Michael and Jennifer took the stand to defend themselves, but their testimony only reinforced the evidence against them. Under cross-examination, Michael was forced to admit to multiple business failures and his current financial insolvency. Jennifer's attempts to minimize her gambling problems were undermined by the documented evidence of her debts and casino bans. "Isn't it true, Mr. Matthews?" Mr. Harrison asked Michael, "that you currently owe over $200,000 to various creditors? Those are temporary financial difficulties. Isn't it true that you applied for business loans using your expected inheritance from your father as collateral? I may have mentioned, isn't it true that you haven't had a profitable business venture in over 15 years? Michael's answers became increasingly defensive and evasive. Jennifer fared no better when questioned about her gambling debts and her false claims to creditors about her expected inheritance. The turning point came when Mr. Harrison introduced evidence that both siblings had been making financial commitments based on their expected inheritance while simultaneously claiming they had no idea Dad was planning to change his will. "You've testified that your father never gave you any indication he was dissatisfied with your financial management," Mr. Harrison said to Jennifer. "Yet you told 3 separate creditors that you were expecting a large inheritance that would allow you to pay off your gambling debts. How do you reconcile those statements?" Jennifer's attempt to explain the contradiction was unconvincing. It became clear that she and Michael had been counting on Dad's money while ignoring his growing disappointment in their behavior. Whitman's closing argument was a desperate attempt to refocus attention on the undue influence claims, but Judge Sanderson's questions during the proceedings suggested she was unimpressed with the petitioners. Case. Mr. Harrison's closing was concise and powerful. "Your Honor, Robert Matthews made his final decisions with a clear mind, based on decades of observation and supported by extensive documentation. He left his estate to the child who had proven herself worthy of his trust through sacrifice, responsibility, and love. The petitioners are asking this court to overturn those decisions simply because they don't like the outcome." Judge Sanderson recessed for 2 hours to review the evidence before announcing her decision. When court reconvened, her ruling was swift and decisive. After reviewing all the evidence presented, this court finds no merit in the petitioner's claims of mental incompetence or undue influence. The medical evidence clearly establishes that Robert Matthews possessed full testamentary capacity at the time his will was executed. The documentary evidence, including Mr. Matthews' own written statements, demonstrates that his estate planning decisions were the result of careful consideration over an extended period. Judge Sanderson looked directly at Michael and Jennifer, the petitioner's financial histories and their relationship with the decedent, as documented in the evidence, support rather than contradict the testamentary decisions reflected in the contested will. Her final ruling was unequivocal. The petition to contest the last will and testament of Robert James Matthews is denied. The will shall be admitted to probate as written. But Judge Sanderson wasn't finished. Her final comments were a stinging rebuke to Michael and Jennifer's legal strategy. This court notes that the petition appears to have been filed not based on genuine concerns about the decedent's capacity or the validity of his testamentary decisions, but rather on the petitioner's disappointment with the terms of his will. The court finds the petition to be without substantial merit and awards reasonable attorney fees to the respondent. The additional award of legal fees was the final blow to Michael and Jennifer's case. Not only had they lost their contest, but they would now be responsible for paying my legal costs as well, money they clearly didn't have as we left the courthouse. I felt not triumph, but a profound sense of closure. Dad's final wishes had been vindicated. His assessment of his children's characters had been validated by an impartial court, and his decision to leave his estate to the child who had proven herself worthy had been upheld. The legal battle was over, but more importantly, the question of whether Dad had truly loved me had been answered. The court's ruling was confirmation that his inheritance wasn't a deathbed whim or the result of manipulation. It was the culmination of a lifetime of careful observation and the final expression of a love he'd never been able to show me while he was alive. 2 days after the court ruling, Mr. Harrison called with unexpected news. While going through the final paperwork for the estate transfer, he discovered something that Dad had left with specific instructions not to reveal until after any legal challenges were resolved. "There's a safe deposit box your father rented under a different name," Mr. Harrison explained. "He left very specific instructions that you were only to be told about it if his will was upheld in court. The key was in a sealed envelope in my office files. The safe deposit box was at a bank across town, one Dad had never used for his regular banking. The clerk who led me to the vault seemed curious about why. I was accessing a box that had been rented under the name Robert James with no last name listed. Inside, the box was a single item, a tablet computer with a note attached. For Sarah, to be viewed only after the legal proceedings are complete." Dad and my hands shook as I powered on the device. The screen displayed a single video file labeled for my daughter. I hesitated for a moment, then pressed play. Dad's face appeared on the screen, looking older and frailer than I remembered, but with clear, focused eyes. He was sitting in his study, the same room where I'd found his letters, and he appeared to be alone. "Hello, Sarah," he began, his voice stronger than it had been in his final weeks. "If you're watching this, it means my will has been upheld, and you've inherited what I intended for you to have. It also means that Michael and Jennifer probably tried to contest my decisions, just as I expected they would." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I know you're probably confused about why I left you most of my estate, especially after the way I treated you throughout your life. I know my final words to you in the hospital were cruel and hurtful. I need you to understand that those words were a deliberate lie designed to protect you from exactly what happened in court." My vision blurred with tears as he continued. "I knew Michael and Jennifer would contest my will. They've spent their entire adult lives expecting to inherit my money, and they've made financial decisions based on that expectation. When they discovered the truth, I knew they would claim that you had manipulated me, that you had used false shows of affection to influence my decisions." Dad leaned forward slightly, his expression intense. "By rejecting you publicly in my final days, by making it clear that I supposedly didn't favor you, I gave you legal protection from their accusations. No one could claim that you influenced me through emotional manipulation when everyone heard me say I didn't think you deserved anything." The cruelty of his final words suddenly made sense. It hadn't been a moment of true feeling. It had been His final gift to me, a shield against the legal battle he knew was coming. Sarah, I need you to know that you were never the disappointment in our family. You were the success story I was too proud and too afraid to acknowledge. Every harsh word I ever spoke to you was driven by my own fear that I wasn't worthy of. The love you offered so freely as a child. He stopped speaking for a moment, and I could see him struggling with emotion. Your mother used to tell me that you had the biggest heart of any child she'd ever known. You would draw me pictures calling me your hero, write me notes telling me you loved me, try so hard to make me proud. And I was proud, Sarah. I was so proud that it terrified me. Dad's voice grew stronger as he continued. I was terrified because I didn't know how to be the hero you thought I was. I didn't know how to live up to the unconditional love you offered. So I pushed you away, thinking that if I was harsh enough, you'd stop expecting me to be someone I didn't know how to be. But you kept loving me anyway. Even when I criticized you, even when I withheld support, even when I failed to acknowledge your achievements. You kept being the daughter I didn't deserve, and it made me feel like the worst father in the world. He looked directly into the camera, and it felt like he was looking directly at me. Michael and Jennifer needed my money to succeed, but you succeeded despite my withholding it. They needed my approval to feel worthy, but you built your own sense of worth. They saw me as a source of financial security, but you saw me as a father, even when I failed to act like one. That's why I left you my estate, Sarah. Not because you manipulated me or because I felt guilty about how I treated you. I left it to you because you proved that you loved me for who I was, not for what
I could give you.
You're the only one of my children who ever gave me more than you took. Dad's image on the screen seemed to age before my eyes as he continued. I know I can never undo the damage I caused by withholding my love and approval for so many years. I know that no amount of money can heal the wounds I inflicted by making you doubt your own worth. But I hope this inheritance can at least ensure that Emma has the opportunities I should have provided for you. You sacrificed your daughter's college fund to pay for my medical treatment. That act of selfless love told me everything I needed to know about the woman you'd become. You gave up Emma's future to save my life, even though I'd spent years making you feel like I didn't value yours. Tears were streaming down my face now, but Dad wasn't finished.
I've left you not just money,
Sarah, but documentation of my true feelings about you. The letters I never sent, the records I kept of your achievements, the evidence of how proud I was of the life you built without my help. I hope someday you'll be able to forgive me for being too afraid to tell you these things while I was alive. He paused again, and when he resumed speaking, his voice was softer, more vulnerable than I'd ever heard it. I want you to know that when you brought Emma to visit me, those were the happiest moments of my final years. Watching you with her, seeing the loving mother you'd become despite my failures as a father, gave me hope that the damage I caused wasn't permanent. Emma is going to grow up secure in her mother's love in a way that you never did. And that's because you learned from my mistakes instead of repeating them. Use this inheritance wisely, Sarah. Use it to give Emma the security and opportunities I should have given you. Use it to build the life you've always deserved. And if you can find it in your heart, try to remember that even when I couldn't. Show it. I loved you every single day of your life. Dad looked away from the camera for a moment, then back. I hope that someday, when you think about me, you'll remember not just the father who failed you, but the father who was proud of you. Because I was proud, Sarah. I was so proud of who you became, and I'm sorry I never found the courage to tell you that when it would have mattered most. The video ended with Dad reaching toward the camera, and the screen went black. I sat in that bank vault for a long time, crying and trying to process everything I'd just heard. The father I'd spent my life trying to understand had finally explained himself, had finally given me the words I needed to hear for 34 years. He'd loved me. He'd been proud of me. His harsh treatment hadn't come from disappointment or indifference. It had come from his own fear and inadequacy. He'd recognized my worth even when he couldn't express it, and his final decisions had been based on a lifetime of careful observation and growing. Understanding the inheritance wasn't guilt money or compensation for his failures as a father. It was recognition belated but sincere of the daughter who had proven her love through sacrifice, who had built strength through adversity, who had become worthy of his trust even when he'd been unable to show his own worthiness of her love. As I left the bank, I felt something I'd never experienced before, complete certainty about my father's love for me. The wounds of childhood might never fully heal, but they no longer define my understanding of our relationship. Dad had been a flawed man who'd loved imperfectly, but genuinely, and his final message had given me the closure I'd spent my entire life seeking. 6 months after the court ruling, I was sitting in the financial advisor's office, finalizing the plans for Dad's inheritance. The numbers still felt surreal after a lifetime of financial struggle. I was now responsible for managing nearly $2 million in assets. But more than the money, I was focused on honoring Dad's intentions and building the secure future he'd wanted for Emma and me. I want to establish a college fund for Emma first, I told Margaret Santos, who had agreed to continue serving as my financial advisor. She should have the educational opportunities I had to fight for. That's wise, Margaret agreed. With proper investment, we can ensure her education is fully funded regardless of what college she chooses or what career path she pursues. I'd already decided that Emma's college fund would be substantial but not unlimited. I wanted her to have security and opportunity, but I also wanted her to understand the value of work and achievement. Dad's inheritance would give her a foundation, but she'd still need to build her own life on top of it. I also want to set aside money for the nonprofit where I work, I continued. They've been struggling with funding, and I'd like to establish an endowment for family counseling services. This felt like the most appropriate use of part of Dad's legacy. He'd spent his life struggling to understand how to love his children properly. Now his money could help other families learn to communicate and connect in healthier ways. The house had been the most difficult decision. Dad's home held so many memories, painful ones from my childhood, but also recent discoveries about his. True feelings for me. I'd ultimately decided to sell it and use the proceeds to buy a larger home for Emma and me, one where we could create new memories without the weight of old pain. Emma had adjusted to our changed circumstances with the resilience that 8-year-olds often display. She understood that Grandpa had left us money to make our lives easier, and she'd been excited about the prospect of having her own room in a backyard. But she'd also asked thoughtful questions about why her aunt and uncle were angry with us. They thought Grandpa was going to give them his money instead of us, I'd explain carefully. Sometimes grown-ups fight about money when someone dies. But Grandpa wanted us to have it, right? Yes, sweetheart. He wanted us to have it. Then they should be happy for us, like when my friends get good things. Emma's simple logic highlighted the fundamental difference between her perspective and that of my siblings. She saw Dad's gift as something to be grateful for, while Michael and Jennifer saw it as something stolen from them. I'd heard through Dad's former neighbors that Michael and Jennifer were both struggling financially following the legal defeat. Michael had been forced to declare bankruptcy, and Jennifer had entered a gambling addiction treatment program. Part of me felt sad for them, but I couldn't bring myself to feel guilty about Dad's decisions. The inheritance had allowed me to make changes in my own life as well. I'd reduced my client load at work, giving me more time to spend with Emma and to pursue training in specialized therapy techniques. I'd always been passionate about helping families heal from trauma, and now I had the financial security to focus on the work I loved rather than just paying bills. One afternoon, while Emma was at school, I'd returned to Dad's grave for the first time since his funeral. I'd brought the tablet with his final video message, wanting somehow to share my thoughts with him. I understand now, I said aloud, feeling slightly foolish but needing to say the words. I understand why you did things the way you did. I understand that you loved me, even when you couldn't show it. The cemetery was quiet except for the sound of wind through the trees. I'm going to use your inheritance to build something good. Dad, Emma's going to grow up secure in ways I never was. But she's also going to understand the value of work and kindness and sacrifice. I paused, thinking about the complex legacy Dad had left behind. I forgive you for being afraid to love me out loud. But I also want you to know that I would have loved you just as much if you'd been gentle with me. You didn't need to push me away to make me strong. Standing there, I felt a sense of closure that had been building since I'd discovered his letters and watched his video. Dad had been a flawed father who'd loved him perfectly, but he'd also been a man who'd ultimately tried to make amends in the only way he knew how. The college acceptance letter that arrived for Emma in May was early. She'd been accepted into a gifted program at a private school that would challenge her academically while providing the kind of individualized attention I'd always wanted for her. The tuition was substantial, but thanks to Dad's inheritance, it was easily affordable. Look, Mom, Emma said excitedly, leaving the acceptance letter. I got into the smart kids' school. You did, sweetheart. Grandpa would be so proud of you. Do you think he knows? I thought about Dad's video message, about his hopes for Emma's future, about his determination to ensure she had opportunities he hadn't provided for me. I think he does know, I said, and I think he's very happy. That evening, I'd sat down to write a letter of my own, not to Dad, but to Emma, to be opened when she turned 18. In it, I'd explained the full story of her grandfather's inheritance, the legal battle with her aunt and uncle, and the complex family dynamics that had led to Dad's final decisions. Your grandfather was a man who loved imperfectly but genuinely, I had written. He made mistakes in how he showed love, but his final actions proved that he understood what really mattered. He left us this inheritance not because he felt guilty, but because he recognized that love isn't about what we say, it's about what we sacrifice for each other. I want you to know that this money comes with responsibility. Your grandfather worked hard to build this wealth, and he chose to leave it to us because he believed we would use it wisely. He wanted you to have security and opportunity, but he also would have wanted you to become the kind of person who earns those gifts through your own character and choices. As I'd sealed the letter and put it away for the future, I thought about the different person I'd become over the past year. The uncertain, approval-seeking daughter who'd walked into Dad's hospital room had been replaced by a woman who understood her own worth, who could fight for what she deserved, who could accept love even when it came in unexpected forms. Dad's inheritance had given Emma and me financial security, but his final message had given me something more valuable, the knowledge that I'd been loved all along. Even when that love had been too complicated and fearful to express itself properly, I was building a new life on the foundation Dad had provided. But I was building it with the confidence and strength that his harsh lessons had ultimately taught me. It was a strange and complex legacy, but it was ours, and we were going to make something beautiful from it. 1 year after Dad's death, Emma and I were sitting in our new home's backyard, watching her practice the violin and instrument she'd chosen to learn with the confidence that came from knowing her education was secure. The late afternoon sun was warm on my face, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt genuinely at peace with my place in the world. Mom, Emma said, setting down her violin, do you think Grandpa would like our new house? I looked around. At the garden we planted together, the swing set I'd installed, the reading nook where we spent our evenings going through homework and bedtime stories. I think he'd love it, sweetheart. I think he'd love seeing how happy you're here. The past year had brought profound changes to our lives. But the most important change wasn't financial, it was the knowledge that we belonged to each other completely, that our small family was built on genuine love rather than obligation or expectation. The foundation I'd established in. Dad's memory was beginning to make a real difference in our community. The Robert Matthews Family Healing Center provided counseling services to families struggling with communication and connection issues. Every month, we helped parents learn to express love more openly and children learn to understand their own worth regardless of their parents' ability to show affection. It's funny, I told Dr. Rodriguez during one of our sessions. Dad's inability to show love directly has somehow enabled me to help other families avoid the same patterns. How does that feel, knowing that his struggles have led to healing? For others, it feels like redemption, I'd answered. Not just for him, but for our whole story. All that pain wasn't meaningless if it helps other families find their way to healthier connections. Emma had thrived in her new school, making friends easily and excelling in her studies. But more importantly, she was growing up with the kind of emotional security I'd never known as a child. She knew without question that she was loved, valued, and supported. When she struggled with homework, I helped her without criticism. When she succeeded, I celebrated her achievements openly. When she made mistakes, she knew they wouldn't affect my love for her. "You're breaking the cycle," Dr. Rodriguez had observed. "You're giving Emma what you wish you'd received, while still maintaining the strength and independence your father's methods inadvertently taught you." Michael and Jennifer had both reached out once in the past year, separate phone calls that felt more like final attempts at reconciliation than genuine overtures. Michael had called on my birthday, his voice strained and formal. "Sarah, I wanted to apologize for how things got between us," he'd said. "I know the legal challenge was difficult." "It was necessary," I'd replied. "You needed to contest the will to understand that Dad's decision was real." I've been thinking a lot about Dad, about the things that came out during the court proceedings. Maybe I didn't understand him as well as I thought I did. Maybe none of us did until the end. Are you happy with how everything turned out?" The question had surprised me with its genuine curiosity rather than bitterness. "I'm happy that Dad's final wishes were respected. I'm happy that Emma has security. I'm sad that our family couldn't find a way to stay connected through this."
Yeah, me too.
Jennifer's call had been shorter but more emotionally honest. "I'm in a good program now," she'd said without preamble. "Gambling addiction counseling. It's helping me understand a lot of things about myself and about money and about about family. I'm glad you're getting help. I wanted you to know that I don't blame you anymore. For the inheritance, I mean. I was angry for a long time, but my counselor helped me see that my anger was really about other things, about feeling like Dad loved you more, about my own problems with money and control." "Jennifer, let me finish. I think maybe Dad did love you more. Or maybe he loved us all the same but respected you more. And maybe maybe that was fair. Maybe I needed to earn respect instead of expecting it." The conversation had ended with both of us crying, but it had brought a kind of closure I hadn't expected to find as Emma and I prepared for bed in our comfortable new home. I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. The scared, approval-seeking woman who'd walked out of Dad's hospital room a year ago had been transformed by the discovery of his true feelings and the validation of his final choices. "Mom?" Emma asked as I tucked her into bed. "I know Grandpa left us money, but what else did he leave us?" The question was more profound than she probably realized. "He left us proof that we were loved," I said carefully. "He left us security, so we could make choices based on what we wanted, not just what we needed. And he left us a responsibility to use his gifts wisely." "What kind of responsibility?" "To help other people, to be kind, to remember that having money doesn't make us better than anyone else. It just gives us more ways to make a positive difference. Like the counseling center you started, exactly like that." After Emma fell asleep, I sat in my home office looking at the framed photo I'd placed on my desk, not a family portrait from childhood, but a new picture of Emma and me at the groundbreaking ceremony for the family center. We were both smiling genuinely, both confident in our place in the world, both secure in our love for each other. Next to it sat another frame containing one of Dad's unsent letters, the one where he'd written about being proud of the woman I'd become despite his failures as a father. Some nights I reread those words when I needed to remember that love could exist even when it wasn't perfectly expressed. The inheritance had given us financial freedom, but Dad's final revelations had given us something more important: my understanding that we'd always been worthy of love, even when we couldn't feel it. His harsh methods had made me strong, but his hidden pride had made me whole. I thought about the families we were helping at the counseling center, parents learning to express affection openly and children learning to trust in their own worth. Dad's struggle to love well was becoming other families' opportunity to love better. As I prepared for sleep, I felt grateful for the complexity of our story. It would have been easier if Dad had simply been a good father who expressed love openly, but perhaps it wouldn't have been as meaningful. His flawed love had taught me to value genuine affection over empty praise, to build strength through adversity, and to understand that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Emma would grow up knowing she was cherished, but she would also grow up understanding that love requires both giving and receiving, both strength and tenderness. She would have Dad's financial legacy to provide security, but she would also have his emotional legacy filtered through my own healing to guide her. Toward healthy relationships, Dot, the girl who had once drawn pictures of my hero daddy, had finally found peace with the complicated hero he'd actually been. And now, in our quiet home filled with genuine love and hard-won wisdom, we were writing a new chapter of the Matthews family story, one where love was expressed openly, where worth was never questioned, and where Dad's final gift continued. To create healing that would extend far beyond our own lives, the inheritance wasn't just money. It was redemption, validation, and the foundation for a legacy of love that would be expressed better than Dad had ever managed, but would be rooted in the strength his imperfect love had ultimately given us. And that, I thought as I drifted off to sleep, was exactly what he would have wanted.